Well, welcome everyone. We're really excited to have you all here for our fourth Thought Leader series, um, our panel series presented by the National Youth Leadership Council. Just a quick who we are. NYLC, we actually celebrated our 43rd year this year as an organization. We have been here to expand service learning, youth voice, and youth leadership for 4 decades. And we are supporting young people to make meaningful change in their communities, to be civically engaged. And we're really excited to have this really dynamic panel of experts with us today during Civic Learning Week so that we can jump into the understanding young people's political and civic engagement as a counter to democratic backsliding. So again, welcome and thank you all for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Pam Siebert, our Vice President of Community Impact and Evaluation at NYLC and today's facilitator. Pam?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to see you here. Sorry about the beeping noise on my end. We are here to talk about, as Amy said, understanding young people's political and civic engagement as a counter to democratic backsliding. And if you're not familiar with the term, democratic backsliding means a degradation of the norms and institutions of democracy. And so at NYLC, we are working on a research project along with one of our panelists today, Dr. Matthew McWilliams and the Freudenberg Foundation in Germany, to look at service learning and civic education. One of the things that brought us together around this topic is the fact that with each generation that comes along, there has been shown through Dr. McWilliams' research and others less and less support for democracy as an institution. And that's something that we all find concerning. And I think in terms of the general public, when we started this project 2 years ago, I think we had to explain why that was important, and I don't think we have to explain anymore because I feel like we're all living it and seeing things happen that we would not have expected. And yet we know that young people are part of the solution currently and can be in the future as well. So I'll just take a few seconds to introduce our panelists today. So we are happy to have with us Wilfred Chirinos from Generation Citizen, and he is originally from Providence, Rhode Island, and a policy and advocacy manager on Generation Citizen's Civic Voice and Policy team. He's a Boston University graduate and a Master of Public Policy candidate at Northeastern. At Generation Citizen, he leads policy research, state-level advocacy, and data impact and evaluation while supporting their coalition and field-building efforts. We also have with us today Dr. Matthew McWilliams. And Matthew is a global public opinion lead at the Foundation International Communications Hub and serves as a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund, senior external advisor for European Movement International, and president of McWilliams Sanders Communications. He is a political scientist with a PhD from the University of Massachusetts and BA from University of Pennsylvania. And his research examines democratic backsliding and the rise of authoritarianism across more than 29 countries. We also have with us today Emiliana Corin. She's a junior at Athens Academy in Athens, Georgia. She is passionate about social justice, human rights, and volunteerism. She loves community organizing and working with local and national organizations to promote educational and advocacy issues. And she is a member of NYLC's Youth Advisory Council. And last but not least, we have with us Ezra Snell. Ezra is a Mississippi native and 2024 graduate of Jackson State University, who has worked with multiple initiatives supporting low-income families and incarcerated individuals. After graduating in sociology, he moved to Tulsa to serve as a policy fellow, helping to lead a major voter engagement effort that contributed to the historic election of the city's first Black mayor. He is an alum of the Aspen Young Leaders Fellowship and current Youth Advisory Council member with the Aspen Institute Center for Rising Generations. And he's now pursuing a Master of Public Policy at Cornell University. So We really appreciate these folks joining us today. We are going to start asking. I have some specific questions for each of them based on their areas of expertise, and then from there we will jump into more of a general discussion. So I'm going to start with Matthew, and wondering how does your research help us understand the urgency of youth civic participation? And then what warning signs should we be paying attention to?
Well, let me just start out with a headline. And the headline is what uh, discussions like this and the work of youth over the next 5, 10 years will really determine, I think, the future of democracy or not. Not just in the United States, but uh, globally, especially in Europe and Eurasia, where I've done work. And what I study authoritarianism. That's where I started. And I studied democracy, not at the elite level, not at the mid level, but at the popular level, people. And what is very clear in the United States and also across Europe is that authoritarianism has been activated. It's always there in the population, but it's been activated. It's about 35, 36, 37% of the United States population. And when authoritarians are active, democracy is in danger. On the flip side, I study democracy, consistency of support with democracy. And what we find is this very difficult demographic problem. And the problem is people like me who are sunsetting in our lives uh, are very supportive of democracy. About 65% of us in the United States are consistent supporters of democracy when we measure it. But 18 to 29-year-olds, only 24% of them are consistent supporters of democracy. That's a 41% difference. So as my generation moves on, to that other world, and 18 to 29-year-olds and younger, like Emiliana, take over, we have this problem, this democratic deficit, which is growing. It's not young people's fault. I'm not blaming young people's. I can blame the system for that. And so we're on a path that is very dangerous. Trumpism and Orbanism and um, uh, anywhere in the world where you see this arising, this is all an outcome of these big changes, and it's also an outcome of the weaponization of propaganda once again. Uh, and you will make the difference over the next 10 years of winning or losing democracy in the United States. Right now, if I ask young people who are inconsistent supporters of democracy, remember that 76% of young people, what democracy is, they say lies. Voting, but voting doesn't matter, and all sorts of other negative things. So we have a big lift. It's really important. It's not your fault. It's the fault of my generation, quite frankly. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks for that. And so I'm going to turn to Wilfred. How are schools and legislators responding to young people's civic energy? And then where do you see meaningful openings for youth voice in that realm?
Well, first, I want to start off with a quick thank you to NYLC, Amy, Pam, everybody for letting me join this wonderful conversation with the panelist. And Matthew, you kicked us off on the right note. I'm going to speak specific to the U.S. context, but obviously there's a lot of parallels to this in other situations globally. But I think it's fair to say that, in particular for schools in this moment, the response to young people's civic energy has been mixed, especially when you start to look at something like the student walkouts in response to ICE's actions. And a lot of that sometimes has to do with or comes into conflict with the laws that states have around excused absences for political activism. But I think generally speaking, schools have long known and are more aware now that schools are not absent of politics and are very much part of the everyday flow of this. I mean, I think they're grappling with this even more so now because of social media, right? Students are very aware about what's happening in their communities and also what's happening globally, right? And obviously, there's the conversation around mis and disinformation, but just in a general sense, like students, young people are very politically aware. But it's a matter of taking that political awareness and the feelings that come out of that, and cultivating that into energy, that allows them to participate meaningfully in their communities. Um, so I think I think when we're talking about how schools should respond, I think it's first to important to acknowledge that teachers, schools, and school districts are, kind of going through it right now, just kind of given all the uncertainty at the federal level. But I think there's a community, a growing community of students, teachers, elected officials, advocates across many states that are looking to provide opportunities for students to equip themselves with civic resources, with media literacy, and just generally with the political efficacy needed to participate. So the best example I can give you right now is the kind of the growing policy of civic seals. So these are kind of diploma recognitions, optional diploma recognitions, that are set up either in some cases through like the State Department of Education, in some cases through legislative offices. But these are not new mandates, but allow students to opt into these civic engagement opportunities, and then receive a recognition that is noticeable to colleges, that is allows them to advance in career skills. And I won't get into all of it right now. But yeah, as far as legislators, I will tell you from at least from my vantage point, it seems like whether they like it or not, they have to be responsive to and engage with youth, if for anything, for their political survival, right? And that's something that's extending across party lines, right? Both parties are in some way, shape, or form looking to engage with youth. And so I think similarly with schools, some legislators are excited to be engaging with young people and young people's civic energy, and I think some are a bit scared. But I will say something that's very positive and creative that I've been seeing in terms of how legislators are engaging in youth voice is the creation of legislative youth councils within state legislators, in some cases within state offices. The Rhode Island Secretary of State, Secretary Moore, he runs a civic leadership program that engages high schoolers with their government directly. And so that's where I kind of see that's an example, I think, of a meaningful way of engaging, or a meaningful opening for youth voice, right? That institutionalizing. But I wouldn't be very good at my job if I didn't mention the power of civic education, right? I think that the best way that we can amplify youth voice is by giving them the tools that they need to not only have their voices heard, but to turn their ideas into action. And to turn this action into something geared towards their community, right? Like having young people understand and build an investment into their community. Um, so yeah, that's where I'll park it. But yeah, that's my sense there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to Emiliana. Through your capstone research and your experience as a young leader, what motivates young people to engage even when systems feel unresponsive?
So, first off, I want to say I feel extremely underexperienced on this board. I'm incredibly honored to be kind of highlighted for the work I've done, and I'm going to explain a bit more about what I have been doing, because pretty much since I wrote that bio for NYLC and serving as a YAC member, I've done a lot. So my school offers a selective 2-year academic project called a capstone where you choose your specialization. In your senior fall, you defend this, all parts of your work, experiential learning, mentorship, research, and contribution before an academic committee. Um, Mine studied how community service and human connection influence civic engagement. I successfully defended it, becoming the 26th person in my school's history to do so, and the first one to do it in a political context. So It's really interesting that this question comes up here about how institutions don't really, um, how youth feel that institutions don't support them, because it's the only question that I wasn't able to answer in my defense. And that's because the committee before me was from those very institutions putting down youth at my school. Young people do have that drive to engage. And as Wilfred just said, I see it every time that I talk to my local youth leaders. Currently, there are youth here in Georgia, for example, speaking to their state legislators to actually put forth bills. For example, I know two groups, one of them who is putting together a bill for mental health resources at school, and the other one is for media literacy programs to be accepted. So the issue really isn't interest or want from youth, it's accessibility. The most meaningfully engaged youth are often never even given the time of day. And it's a very purposeful exclusion. It's to preserve a status quo and keep youth leadership outside of these civic spaces. I faced a lot of rejection throughout my capstone. Program directors told me to drop it entirely within my school system. When I tried to form a civic space on campus, I had to meet with the deans of my school over concerns for my personal safety. I sent over 30 cold emails a day to public employees in the state of Georgia, and I was met with silence or even worse. So I got emails from higher ups within the public school system telling me to drop this project. My motivation, honestly, it comes out of spite. My biggest allies in finishing anything big are the people who tell me to not do it in the first place. So I not only did this capstone, I did it well. But for the broader community of young people, we have to build accessibility. If we give tools in those unconventional spaces, such as through school walkouts, through panels such as this, and youth boards, we could see youth leadership and voice bloom uncontrollably in the civic world.
Thanks. Well, I really applaud your resilience and would love to hear some more about that at some point. But thanks for your grit and perseverance. And so, for Ezra, you have worked on large-scale voter engagement efforts. What did you learn about mobilizing young people and communities who may feel historically included, and not just feel, who were historically excluded?
Thank you for that question. And like other people expressed, I am really happy to be here today. I love the question, especially about the part of those who have been historically excluded, because my voter engagement work was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And if anyone's familiar with the history of Tulsa, Oklahoma, over a little over 100 years ago, there was a race massacre that happened in that area. And pretty much the entire Black community that was living in Tulsa had their homes and communities and neighborhoods bombed and burned down with no insurance payments towards them. And that primarily descendants of those people are living in North Tulsa. And so when I was living in Tulsa, working as a policy fellow, our voter engagement efforts are targeted towards that particular area. And because it was targeted towards that particular area, we wanted to be able to bring in people from that area to actually be the ones that were helping with this voter initiative. And of course, that included young people. Now, when I was there, one of the things that was challenging was kind of combating apathy. And that was apathy on the adult side, but also apathy on the youth side, because we were registering high school students. We were going in literally with voter registration forms in our hands, sitting in high school cafeterias during the middle of the day, trying to get students to come over and register to vote. You always have those students who, maybe like Elamina, who are interested in trying to register to vote and trying to get out there to change things. And others really didn't even know there was an election going on, which wasn't just them. There were also adults that were also in that same vein. And so when I'm thinking about, how are we kind of thinking about how we can kind of combat this, apathy is one of the main things I'm really looking at. And one of the ways that I found most effective in trying to really push at that or push back against that was connecting it with, what do they actually want for their communities? It a lot of times when we're thinking about voting, we think about it as the end all be all. You go out on that Tuesday, you cast your ballot, and then you're done. Where the cards lay, they lay. And that simply isn't the case. What I want people to realize, and young people especially to realize, is that civic engagement and what it looks like to be civically engaged does not just have to be voting. And in fact, it really isn't. They can be teachers, educators, mentors, community leaders, advocates, organizers. They can build their own things. Elamir was talking about trying to start a civics club at her high school, trying to do things like that, or just participating in one, because there probably are people already doing the things that you would like to be able to do. And if you don't feel like you're that, tapped in, or you don't feel like you're that engaged, you don't have the capacity to do that, then you can simply try to, give your time where you can. I don't want it to be that, voting is the only way that people feel like they can change things, because quite frankly, that's how we get into the situation of apathy to begin with, because we're looking at, every year people vote. And I'm still seeing things in my community of being affected negatively. I'm still seeing politicians who are getting into office who are hurting my communities. I'm still seeing, my family not be able to afford to buy food. I'm still seeing my neighborhoods be degraded. And so we're thinking about how can we mobilize young people. I think connecting it to their own lived experiences and connecting it to, how can they in their own lives. It doesn't have to be, starting a national nonprofit. It doesn't have to be being on the front lines of the protests. It can be in your everyday lives. It can be, joining one who is maybe volunteering at a local food shelter. It can be, if they're like we had our own voter engagement efforts. If you see a voter engagement campaign where people are trying to register to vote, volunteer. We actually are paying our canvassers $20 an hour to get out there and get people registered. And so there's also an incentive within that regard. But it shouldn't just be voting, because if it is just voting and you're seeing the same things happening as they are happening now, when voting alone isn't working, that's going to lead to more apathy. And so connecting to the everyday lives of what people are actually experiencing and make sure that they know that civic engagement isn't just that and they can be much more is a really good way to combat that.
Thank you. I'm going to jump into some discussion questions here and looking for any of you panelists who have a perspective on this. Where do you see the greatest disconnect between how institutions view young people and how young people view democracy? And Wilfred, I know you had talked about, legislatures forming youth councils.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's something you want to
Yeah,
start
no,
off
I'm
with.
I'm I'm happy to hop in here. I just wanted to, make sure everybody had a chance to jump into the double dutch. But yeah, I'll talk a bit about that. Yeah, so I think Matthew started to touch a bit on this on the how young people are perceiving democracy just generally. So there's a great report that was released by Circle and Protect Democracy. Circle is the forgive me, Circle, for not knowing the acronym off the top of my head, but it is they do a lot of research on the civic engagement and youth voice field, and their research showed that in the U.S., 30%, 36% of youth agree or strongly agree that U.S. democracy today can address the issues that the country is facing, and 16% of youth agree or strongly agree that the democracy is working well for young people. So off the bat, we're talking about much more than less than 50% of young people saying that this is a system that is currently not working for us, right? And as Matthew started to touch on touch a bit on this on the generational divide, um, right? Like we, unlike our older peers, who have a trust institutions, but do not trust the actors in it. Young people seem to have the inverse relationship with our institutions. We don't believe that these institutions are built to to confront the issues of today, right? They're inflexible. Whereas, we don't believe that like the actors are necessarily manipulating this. And so when I see the disconnect, when I look at the disconnect, what I see is institutions asking themselves, how can we get young people to engage? Where the question should really be, how can we engage young people in a way by making ourselves more responsive and more accessible to young people, right? Um, so I think that's where it's two people waiting to try to, reconcile, but both of them are waiting for one another, I guess is the picture I'm trying to paint. But I'll let others jump in.
I can also jump in. I thought it was really interesting. What was this? What you just said, because I was looking at the same thing, and I do agree that there can be like an inverse kind of perspective on it, and maybe it's just the spaces that I tend to inhabit, because at least within my general circle, it is that young people are seeing the actual people within the system as being the manipulators, and the system itself also not working as efficiently as it can be. And so I think that what people are really frustrated with right now is that, we're seeing this sort of backsliding when it comes to our government. And there are politicians who kind of come in and they give lip service to how things can be changed and what they're going to do. And all of these incredible, well, I shouldn't even say incredible, they have their platforms that they run on. But then when they get in there, people feel like they're not actually challenging things in the way that they were doing or saying that they would do once they were actually campaigning. And so when I'm looking at, how young people are actually being viewed within this, one of the things I really want to make sure is that, there is a space for young people to still be engaged with these types of civic conversations and civic actions that don't have to be hinged on their ability to cast a ballot at 18 years of age. Because like I said earlier, you know if that's your only kind of perspective of how you can change things, or you can be involved in a change, it can lead you to really feel like you're doomed. Like, you come in and you turn 18, now you can do something, but now that you've done this thing that everyone said that is so important to do, and you still feel like things are being changed. And so, making sure that young people and the system themselves and the older people themselves are actually creating these spaces intentionally, not for just a young person to serve as a representative, or not to serve as a token, to be actually be a part of designing the systems, designing the decision making process.
Yeah, can I jump in too? Because I think both Wilfred and Ezra, these are really interesting. To me, the institutions, if you look where the money has gone, uh, the money has gone to make people, to tell people to vote, 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 vote. And it's flattened the notion of democracy down to if you vote, that's it, which is an impoverished way to look at democracy. If you go back to de Tocqueville, he talked about how civic participation being what was critical in America, and it was across all sorts of different things. So you have that problem. And then the way young people look at institutions, Ezra, you said this inflexible, or Wilfred, you said this inflexible. And they are, because they just want vote, 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 vote. And then you have Emiliana saying, I try to reach out to these people, they don't want to hear me. The one thing I'd say is don't wait for them to create spaces for you, because they're not. You're going to have to break down the doors to do it. That's what has to be done. And it's not easy to do. I mean, I watched it during the Vietnam War happening. Um, it's not easy to do, but that's what is required. Because if it's just vote, 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 it goes actually to Ezra, exactly what you were saying. People just feel like I vote and it doesn't really matter because nothing changes, right?
Wow. Thanks for that. And so that's actually a kind of a good segue to our next question. So, going back to the Tulsa massacre and before, and the civil rights movement, and even to today, Miliana, what you described as trying to exercise your civic rights and being potentially harmed by that. How do we balance protecting young people from harm or potential harm while empowering them to take risks and lead publicly?
Yeah, so I'll actually speak to this. I think that I have a bit of a different perspective because I not only have seen democratic backsliding now as a teenager in Americas, I actually was born into it. I was born in Venezuela, in Caracas, in 2009, actually. So I experienced pretty much the height of the authoritarian regime there and the biggest diaspora in the modern age, which I am a part of. 1/4 of my country has left, and we're advocating every single day for freedom, justice, equality, and democracy. So I think that honestly, you can do both, and that's how my parents raised me. And I think that's a big component as to why I'm one of those people knocking down the doors, why I'm one of those who is encouraging people to vote. So I'm just going to share two stories really quickly. So the first is that I absolutely love to talk and I love to watch movies, but I did not know about paramilitary troops when I was 5 years old. So when I was in a carpool line on my way to preschool, I stopped and I looked at these guys in green suits and I went, guys, look, it's the guys from Toy Story. These were actually the paramilitary groups that the Maduro regime used called colectivos. They would routinely stop and take political dissenters to be prisoners. Um, this really just, I wanted to show the story as a highlight of those who live in situations of democratic backsliding and those who grow up in it aren't necessarily aware of it until they're made aware. And there is a way to raise them with protection. But the other story that I wanted to share is about protesting as a youth. Those same political prisoners, we used to host protests every single night. We would open our windows and we would bang pots and pans together. The Venezuelan regime had taken away every single right that we knew of: speech, assembly, the thought, media, and even our hope. So we did what we could and we opened our window and we just made noise. And I remember doing that. And I was 5 years old, and I did not understand the torture they were putting on these political dissenters under. I did not understand the full wrath of democratic backsliding, but I was still doing something to help what I understood as inherently wrong. And that's, I think, the biggest thing here. When I hear about protection versus empowerment, I think we have to ask what that protection is actually doing. As I've grown up, I've learned more about my country, but I always knew something was wrong, and I always knew that I had to do something to fight back against it. I think that's the most important thing to do now, not terrorize youth with news of horrors, but rather show them that, yes, there is something inherently wrong right now, and they have the power to do something against it.
So powerful. Thank you. Are there thoughts from our other panelists, Matthew?
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much, but I totally agree with Emiliana, and it's protecting young people from harm. We're all in harm's way, and protesting resistance brings with it risks, but it's what we got to do. There's an 89-year-old woman who lives up the street from me who has a big dog that barks all the time, so I'm talking to her all the time because my dog's walking by. And she came out and said, I'm scared. I'm terrified. So, I mean, it's systemic. If you're opposing what's going on right now, you're in harm's way. And I think the way we can mitigate it is to do our best to protect each other. And we saw that in Minneapolis when paramilitary forces went in to try to rip people from homes. People got there and protested around it and made it more difficult. So don't make it easy, make it hard. But you're taking a risk.
Anything else you'd like to add, Wilfred? I saw you off of mute.
Yeah, I'll quickly add that just so GC, we work alongside a lot of teachers, and oftentimes they have this question, right? Like, how do we make sure that we're not putting students in the way of harm, right? Like in the way of um, psychological harm, physical harm, etc. And I think that's the purpose, at least for in our work, for experiential civic learning, in that in the classroom, it allows students to experiment and find their civic voice, that like experiment with democracy and understand what that looks like and feels like, and while focusing on community issues and working through consensus and becoming leaders within their classrooms and within their school communities. And that sometimes publicly, right, that public speaking portion when they present their projects at Civics Days and they're able to, again, in a relatively controlled environment, experiment with that voice. But I, I also very much the Matthew's comments very much resonate with me in that we're all in some form of dangers right now, particularly teachers. If we're talking about groups of folks like in the classroom in the education setting, right? Like, so there's always this tiptoeing of like, okay, how can we make sure that we're not gonna become the target for a federal probe, right? Um, so again, making sure that like we're engaging young people in the classroom and in these controlled environments, but also allowing them to explore ideas of their interest, but also making sure things are engaged in their community and stay nonpartisan.
Thank you. I'm going to jump ahead to the next one. So now we're going to turn to talk about the power of solutions of youth-led action. What data, trends, or lived experiences give you hope about youth civic and political engagement in this moment? I was going to just go to Ezra first since you didn't get to answer the last one. Would you like to start us off on that? Not to put you on the spot, but I am.
No,
You
it's
can
okay.
pass it if you want.
Yeah, I actually do want to talk a little bit about that. I think that this day and age is really special in the fact that I would say, I feel like it would be safe to say, I haven't looked at the stats on this, but I feel like it would be safe to say the majority of young people that live, especially in the West, are on social media in some form or fashion. And because of that, they have, and I should say they, but we have access to images and media and news across the globe 24/7. And I think that that is something that can be scary in a lot of ways, but it's also really exciting because it has a potential to allow people to see the injustices that are happening within their own communities, but also across the world, and to be able to communicate and organize digitally to actually combat that. I really think about, when we're looking at what may be happening in Minneapolis, for example, you, people don't live in Minneapolis. We don't know what is really going on. But I know when I go on my social media feed, I see people who are there on the ground talking about here's what the news is not showing with their camera phones, literally recording interactions that they're having with people either on the street or sometimes in their own homes. And I think that going beyond where the news camera often doesn't is something that's really special. And it actually is able to mobilize and galvanize young people to actually think about things in a deeper and more systemic way because they're understanding that the media that we have right now, the current outlets that we're looking at to get information from, are not complete, and oftentimes they may intentionally be hiding what's happening to serve whoever owns the companies or whatever agenda that particular media outlet has when it comes to how they present news, knowing that that's not the full truth. But there are people who are on the ground who are actually with their own phones or one of these who are able to record and show and capture everything that's happening within their own communities. I think that's an incredible thing.
Who wants to jump in on that one next? I could just follow up on that for a second while you're thinking. So I don't know if you all know this, but NYLC's headquarters is we're a national organization, but our home base is in the Twin Cities. And so some of us, and I'm sure others on this call, maybe from our local area, have experienced that. And if I might add from my personal experience, one thing that was really gave me hope was seeing it wasn't a generational response. It was an everyone response. So people being targeted were all ages. In my larger neighborhood at a neighboring community, there was a teenager who was taken off the street by ICE. And this, community responded. And then also in the resistance, I saw no difference. There were people young and old working together, and it really seemed to me like a unique thing that I hadn't really seen before. there was no division. You didn't, whoever was taking leadership took leadership. So, Emiliana, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to kind of follow up and go back to what we were talking about. In terms of like trends that I'm seeing, I think voter turnout is one that we particularly have to look at. We're seeing a lot of people show up and a lot of youth show up, and that's leading to huge swings. And honestly, what I've seen that's most interesting is the challengers coming up against incumbents in primary season now. I think that's really interesting. We've talked about it a lot as youth of trusting the system. And when you don't trust the system, you change who's in the system. So I think that's a really interesting trend to look at. And the other, in terms of lived experience, is I'm having a lot of my friends who, honestly, when I would talk about politics, they would just say, that's just not my field. Actually come up and say, hey, I saw this. Is this true? Or, hey, I'm a little worried right now, or I'm scared. And they're actively looking for resources. So I think that's something that's given me a lot of hope.
Great. Matthew, did you want to? You looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I just want to build on that. Because I think we definitely need to change the political class because it is a class, and some of it's moving on anyway. But we need to change it. But I also think we need to fundamentally change the institutions. And I, there is no going back to where we were, which was a democracy that was not functioning very well. But there's no going back to that because it no longer exists. The guardrails, the rules, the norms have been broken. And I think what we need is really a transformative constitutional reboot, a United States 3.0, because we already did 2.0. Remember, Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments were 2.0. They didn't work real well for 100 years, which is why you had Jim Crow, Plessy Ferguson, Plessy separate but equal, and other things. And finally, the civil rights movement started to get us back. But we need a 3.0 because if you look at, I always keep the Constitution close by. um, and I love major parts of it. Parts of it are just outdated, don't work any longer, and it's a real problem. And even worse, it's just being ignored, totally ignored. Basic War Powers Act, you name it. So we need a constitutional reboot, and it's across many different sectors, and just realizing that a lot of the institutions that we're trying to change are totally invested in the Constitution and in the system that's set up. And they're not going to be change makers with us.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great segue. I'm going to keep us moving because I feel like this is maybe the $1 million question or a reason that a lot of us are here. What role should service learning?
I have to go now.
Okay.
Another question.
Nobody's given us $1 million, by the way, but
no,
they
I'm
should.
Just kidding you.
They should. What role should service learning, project-based civic action, youth councils, and legislative engagement, and other methodologies play in rebuilding trust in democracy and democratic systems? Who wants to start us off on that one?
I can. And part of the reason why, I do really have a strong opinion on this is because of my current, service on a youth advisory council, and just, my past experiences serving as a youth voice within an institutional setting. What leads to, like I said in the beginning, a lot of apathy outside of just voting not working, but also if these institutions bring young people into the fold, so to say, but these young people, once they get inside, don't feel like they actually have, that much power, or they feel like they're being used as a representative to, on the surface level, look like make the institution look like it's inclusive, but there is no decision making, there is no power, there is no designing within the system. And so, when we're thinking about, how can this change, how can service learning, civic engagement, all of that actually bring young people to a point where they feel like they actually are valued? I think one, it takes actually value in what they have to say and how they actually view what's going on. And so taking their viewpoints into consideration and being serious about that and letting them know, and through actual action, showing them that you are a part of the designing process, or you are a part of the decision making process. And this isn't to say that I'm feeling like young people have all the answers, because one thing that I've learned in my fellowship that I had with the Aspen Institute is this idea of stocks of knowledge, and that everyone comes with their own knowledge that comes from wisdom, that comes from experience, and older people often pretty much do have more wisdom and experience in a lot of areas. That also doesn't make them the experts, but also young people are the experts within their own lived experience. And when we combine those two things, you have a really synergistic effect in how we actually think about what the future can look like. And so I think making sure that young people are literally a part of the decision making process and literally a part of the designing process of what's going on is crucially important.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that, and Matthew, you brought up the concept of the 2.0, the 3.0, right? We're in desperate need of the 3.0, and I think that's a very timely statement to make given the approaching of the 250th. And Ezra, to your point, this the youth decision-making power, what comes through from service learning, through project-based civic action, youth councils, etc. That feels foundational to the 3.0, at least to me. Obviously in my work, I feel that passion. But if we're talking about, and again, as we're going back to what you were saying, if we're talking about what it means to build America 3.0, we need to ensure that this is, the I mean, with additional items, of course, obviously, there's a lot of things we can add to that foundation, but I think this is very much part of that. That youth have not only a seat at the table, but that they have a plate, a fork, a knife, a cup, a napkin, and all the other things, ready to join the meal. Um, but what I'll close with here is, um, again, in my work, we one of the initiatives that we're leading is called Future 250. Right, again, going back to the 250th, that is, much of the narrative around the 250th is very heritage and nostalgia based, which is, has its time and its place. But our question is, what does the next 25, 50, 250 years look like, as we continue to move forward? And so in that spirit, right, one thing that we're looking to do is invite young people to be creators of an agenda, right? Like, what does it mean to gather young people who are civically energized, ask them about what do they aspire to see in their democracy, and then actually formulating that into policy. So that's something that we're trying to do. Hopefully, we'll be able to do it. But I do think that when it comes to the some of the foundational things that you mentioned, it we need to have these things, and we're seeing why right now. We're seeing why, like, and we're seeing it amongst our adults too, like the Annenberg Public Policy Institute, like they do their annual Constitution Day survey. Most adults can't name like the three branches of government. Like this is we're talking about young people, obviously, but there's a generational lapse here, right? So like, we are the bleeding's already happening. We need to try to find a way to stop it. But I'll pause there.
Great. Before we move onto the lightning round, Emiliana, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, actually. So I went back as the others were talking, and I actually went directly to my research paper that I wrote for my capstone, which was called The Hand That Feeds. It was about I called it the privilege matrix of service. And that is how there's a kind of service called service tourism, where students from privileged backgrounds, they kind of log hours in communities they don't belong to, and that builds no relationship or intention of returning to those communities, versus students who actually serve in communities that they're genuinely connected to. This came out of my own experience, and I think that this ties so much into what we're talking about. I think anybody in the service learning or civic spaces needs to read Toxic Charity. If you haven't, this is a plug for that book. It's amazing. And it kind of talks about it. Own voice is so important in these communities. And I think Wilfred said it best when he said that youth need a seat at the table when we have this kind of rebranding. And I don't remember where I heard this quote, but I keep it with me whenever I talk about youth councils. When you're not seated at the table, your needs are never going to be on the menu. And even worse, you're on the menu. And that's what youth need to bring into this conversation. They need to have their needs. And I think this is also a plug for what I am doing myself. This April 22nd, we have the Uniting for Good Service Learning Symposium with NYLC, and I'm very excited to be teaching a workshop there about mentorship with youth. I talked about this a bit earlier about how my own mentorship has been really hard, and speaking with adult-centric spaces has led to a lot of rejection, but also a lot of acceptance through organizations such as NYLC that actually do that. So if you guys are available that day, please come listen to it. But I'm just gonna finish there. But yeah.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so now we have, it's not actually called the lightning round, it was rapid response, but it sounds like lightning round to me. And for the presenters, I'm going to skip question number 12 because I feel like we've covered that. I'm trying to keep this on time. So what we're going to do is I'll ask the question and then give each of you, 20 or 30 seconds to respond. We'll just go around the group pretty quickly with these last questions before we get to our reflection. And so I'll do the order just to make it easy, the order that we started with. So that would be Matthew first. What is one concrete action educators can take in the next 6 months to strengthen youth civic engagement?
I think in their classrooms, highlighting 5 minutes a day what's happening outside of the classroom so that it's noticed. It just doesn't go by.
And Wilfred?
Sorry, I didn't get
No, that's okay. I had to
I
check
missed
my
the
list.
cue there. I would say speak with your students what's on their mind. Listen to what they're thinking about, what they're hearing, what they're seeing. And as much as you can, try to democratize your classroom, right? Whether it's like a group, an agreed upon set of norms, a classroom constitution, if you will. Things of that nature, right? Trying to build democratic norms within the classroom, within the school, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Miliana?
Yeah, so we talk about it with the iPard system, but if you're not, you don't necessarily have to do the whole thing, but actually investigating community needs and having your students come up with what they notice in their own communities around them that's wrong, not necessarily on a national stage, but a local one, that's a great start.
And Ezra?
Yes, it's really a reflection of what all of you just said because I 100% agree. Like I said earlier, trying to connect it to the daily lives of what young people are experiencing. And so, there are things happening nationally, but it's also happening locally, really talking about, how can your everyday life look different? Having those conversations within the classroom itself, especially if you are a social studies teacher, a English teacher, a history teacher. I think those are prime environments, kind of like going through those themes and going through, what the history of this country is, but also casting a vision for what it can look like and bringing in your students' own visions as part of that.
Great. And then moving on back to the next question here to do our round. What is one policy or structural change that would significantly expand youth political participation, in your opinion? And Matthew, start us off.
I'll do structural change. Stop institutions and foundations in particular from navel gazing and saying, "Ooh, the sky's falling, democracy's a problem," and get them to start investing in what makes a difference. And that to me is the service learning and Emiliana and Ezra and Wilfred, people doing this work. We know how important this is. We know this needs to get done, but there's this gigantic disconnect with big foundations who are just wasting money on stupid studies, and I read them all the time and say, duh, what's next? Sorry.
Wilfred?
That's gonna be hard to follow up. And it's a shame I only get one too. This is tough. My heart is telling me to go, universal civics education access, like obviously, right? But I think there's also something to be said about pre voter registration, and I know we talked a lot about like voting not being that be all and end all of democracy, but right now, college age voters are staring down a potential disenfranchisement. And so less of that and more of, supporting and introducing young people into the public square as opposed to trying to exclude them from it.
Great. Emiliana?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of gonna do a take from policy and add in, so kind of a replacement. Get rid of service hour requirements for graduation for high school and put in a service project requirement for graduation of high school. Um, I actually submitted this as a bill for the Georgia Girls State, for the American Legion Auxiliary. The research shows like if you look at Maryland, they require a service learning project in order to graduate, and they have the highest rates of youth engagement in terms of local policy and in terms of voter turnout.
And Ezra?
Yes, so I also agree. Civic education within the school system itself is a really big thing, but also increasing and shifting funding towards these types of things. I was working in nonprofit for 1 year, and we were seeing how funding is prioritized in certain areas. And youth civic engagement and youth leadership is a really big area. I think if we take that and sort of advocated for the shifting to be specifically, like Elamia said, either service projects or within the school systems themselves, kind of bringing in the opportunity for these students to be able to express their opinions or to be able to express their own ideas without any fear of repercussions or backlash. Changing what that will actually look like, because we don't want people who have genuinely a desire to change and a desire for action to feel like they can't because their school system says no, or because their government doesn't have any funding or any resource or opportunity for them to actually do that, and so they have to sort of like crowdsource all of the support, essentially things more difficult. And so finding out a way that funding itself and the way that we think about what investment looks like and shifting that towards young people's civic involvement.
Great. And we're going to do our very lightning last reflection. I'll ask each of you in one sentence, what gives you confidence in the future of democracy because of young people? Matthew?
Oh, not the old guy. Well, I tell you, this conversation and meeting Emiliana, Wilfred, and Ezra gives me confidence.
Great.
And just one last thing to Wilfred. Yeah, voting's real important. We gotta vote. But it can't be, and I know you know this, but just for the people listening, it can't be the only thing.
Right.
And that's what the institutions want. Vote and go away. Go away.
Okay.
Let us decide.
Great. Wilfred?
Matthew stole my answer, and yes, absolutely agree. Not the be all and end all of democracy, certainly not. But yeah, I think in one sentence, what gives me hope is seeing the energy of young people in the face of resistance is what's gives me hope.
Great. Emiliana?
Yeah, so my hope comes from pretty much being in my AP government class this year. We're studying case law on civil rights right now, and I've been studying this for 2 years. I've been in a school where we don't talk about politics, and people who aren't political at all are suddenly feeling like they need to act and having questions about what is happening outside versus the precedent that was set before.
Great. Ezra?
Yeah, I think of the Whitney Houston song, "The Greatest Love of All," when she says, "I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way." I think because we're all so young, and there is the opportunity for us to learn and be taught, but also to be the leaders and the teachers themselves. And so, because there is that opportunity to, envision what the future looks like. And just at a conference I was at the other week, it was older people and younger people. And one of the kind of synergies that was talked about there was that you have the wisdom of older people to know how things work, but also the imagination of young people who haven't had their imagination beaten out of them over the years.
Awesome. Well,
And
thank
so,
you so much. Oh, I'm sorry.
oh no, I was going to say, yeah. So that imagination, that vision that young people have is really important.
Great. Well, I'm going to just say thanks to everyone. This has been a really interesting conversation. I hope there's some way we can continue it, and turn it over to Amy to close us out.
Well, I just want to give a huge thank you to our panelists. This was one of the most dynamic discussions, and I think we could keep going another hour at least. But I also want to be respectful of everyone's time. Again, thank you to each of our panelists for sharing your insights. And I know I'm walking away with a lot of new information and some reading materials that I have to add to my long list from all of the things you guys were talking about. I do want to share some upcoming opportunities. This is our last thought leader panel of the year. However, it is not the end of the NYLC convenings. We have a Service Learning is Civic Learning coming up on March 18th. It's a 1-hour free webinar. Please sign up for that. And then the session, Emiliana has a workshop at our Service Learning Symposium, so you can take a deep dive with her. But we have a full day of amazing sessions from leaders in service learning and civic education. It's April 22nd. It's virtual, so no matter where you are, you can join us. We'll have some great speakers and young people on a panel for our closing session. It's going to be a great full day of civic learning and service learning. And then, of course, we hope you'll join us in Washington, D.C. for the 2026 National Service Learning Conference. We've partnered with Points of Light. So it's going to be an amazing gathering in DC in June. We want to see young people, educators, nonprofit leaders come together to really lift up, learn from each other, network, and just engage in really meaningful conversation in the heart of where our democracy lives. So please continue to join us at these upcoming convenings, and stay connected with us. We've got lots of opportunities. Bella's like the queen of our social media and does a great job. So if you're not following us on social media, you should be. You can check out our baby photos. That was happened this last week. Very fun. But also the leader. We've got great blogs and opportunities for you all to contribute your thoughts and ideas as well. So please check out the website, check out our blog, The Generator, and stay connected with us. And with that, I will say, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy the rest of Civic Learning Week. Thank y'all.
Thank you, everyone.